Live streaming is on.
Awesome. And if someone could shoot me a message when it's over, I'll turn it off. Good luck. Congratulations. Bye, y'all.
Okay, Jacob's back. So. Okay, yeah, we were sending the live stream links to people. Okay, yeah, do we have everyone? Let me see the judges. Bridget. Okay. So Alan, Bridget, Dalton, Kevin. Okay, so we have all our judges. Is there anyone not ready? Cool. I'm just gonna pull up the timer. The plan text is the resolution the Islamic Republic of Iran should join the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to solve these one by normal means. Iran becomes a signatory of the JCPOA. And two is at least the U.S. saying yes. Biden sees as a huge win because he doesn't lose anything at the negotiating table. It means he can look tough on Iran because no lifting sanctions on the National Guard means U.S. wants to move Iran out of Russian sphere of influence, which is key in the post-Ukrainian world. Sees U.S. wants oil, particularly true for Biden because Dems are losing due to high inflation. These big policy wins for Dems and Biden. Even if they don't, there's a perception they will soon. So people act as if this is true as threes. Even if the U.S. doesn't say yes, Europe has already joined ASA. Europe has sanctions and status quo, but these are set to go away if Iran signs empirics proof. This is what happened during the Obama administration. Because no reason Europe pulls out. There's no incentive plus they have bigger issues. Advantage one is econ. Uniqueness when supply chains are in disarray due to high prices of petroleum. May the current conflict in Ukraine has spiked the price of oil, particularly across Western world. See barrels doubling or tripling in the price. B's this leads to the massive spillover effects across the entire world because oil costs are continuously get passed down. It has the largest multiplier effect of any price. See, this leads to the inability of shipments to move goods due to high costs and the resulting high cost of these goods. These all triggers massive amounts of inflation, so the price of goods skyrockets. Two is faulty supply chains are poised to trigger a global recession. A is now is Q. We have the result of the price of oil, otherwise it will continue to spiral out of control. There are two warrants for this. The first is high prices beget higher prices due to speculation from investors. The second is spikes at producer sides have to be laid ASAP, otherwise it will compound as things like wages and other products increase. B is the brink is now. There are two reasons. First is that inflation still seems manageable, which is why people are talking about interest rate hikes. Two is China has started to do COVID lockdowns, which means perceptions are beginning to shift key to distract from the C's. Even if you don't buy that the brink is now, inflation makes recession inevitable because it makes economies impossible to function. The link is one in Iran. They're joining the JCPOA, allows them to place their oil on the market. They have 85 million barrels of oil awaiting offshore, and the foreign minister says they will move 3 billion barrels if restrictions are lifted. Every Western country doesn't allow Iran to sell oil to them in the status quo because Iran has not joined the JCPOA. B is that we provide a reversal of that since Iran joining lifts all those sanctions immediately and allows for the immediate trade of oil. C is that countries will buy this oil because they have already restricted their oil supply by saying Russia can't Russia and other countries that support the Russia-Ukrainian war cannot transfer their oil to them. True is that this shifts a perception of supply chain crises is improving investor confidence in supply chain due to oil influx means people move from bond investments to stocks, which uniquely results in inflation because bonds force inflationary practice. B's high investor confidence buoys the stock market, which is key to sustaining through times of economic turmoil. Internal link is one, a supply chain crisis and inflation always triggers recession. A's inability to move product leads to high cost of production, which are then multiplied upon the consumer, leads to the crashing consumer confidence. B's inflation completely deflates savings, which makes any kind of stability impossible and leads to massive risk taking. C's inflation increases jitteriness. That means the stock market tanks because it becomes commonplace. Two is supply chain leads to structural violence. A is the first thing held up in supply chains are those things that help the most marginalized. This is why food shipments to Latin American countries have stopped. They pay less, and at least these countries being hurt the most. B's are particularly true for medications and health tech, which is currently stopped up at ports. B's show people facing massive structural violence. The effects is thus the first is recession. A is any recession would be global, which means that empirically would push 1 billion people into poverty. Empirics have proven in the 2008 recession. B is a priority is the internal like the other forms of structural violence because it makes it impossible to continue with this, which also makes it a prior question. E alternative engagement. Two is a war. A is economic recession and a linchpin for war because they cause rallies around the flag and unbridled patriotism that must be turned over towards diversionary conflict because they blame others for their economic setbacks. This is internal into any conflict because we will isolate Taiwan as the place for this to occur because China's debt is leveraged so tightly this will begin to be aggressive in South China Sea, which means we have a flash forward scenario at least a global power war at least extinctions. Three is structural violence. Unique structural violence because caused by supply shortages of medical technology and food supplies. These outweighs the probability because it is happening right now. We have the empirics to back this. The advantage two is structural violence through foods insecurity. Uniquest one is sanctions on Iran are higher than the status quo. As the UN in 2018 passed a resolution plan to place sanctions on Iran with plans to lift in accordance with their if they accord with the plan of action. However, after Iran left the plan of action, UN extended the sanctions, saying that Iran must join and be found in accordance for these sanctions to be lifted. These in 2020, Trump extended sanctions across the entirety of the Iranian economy, even after the imposition of 2018 sanctions. The EU has placed the trade embargoes on Iran as extension of UN sanction and US sanctions. The two is these sanctions are choking Iran access to food, proliferating sexual violence. As they aren't able to access wheat from Europe, which is particularly key due to skyrocketing prices out of Lebanon due to the current war. B is they can't access water either, which is bad because northern regions are uniquely in a drought right now. C is that no one wants to engage in trade because they're afraid of the U.S. The U.S. sanctions anyone who doesn't sanction Iran. Three is Iran is looking to rejoin the plan of action to loosen sanctions, but U.S. hesitates is why it isn't happening right now, which means SCO isn't solving in at the affirmative key. It means the brink is right now. Link is one. Iran joining the plan of action decreases all sanctions on Iran. And Iran has stated that they will give up their nuclear agency within the POA regulations for UN sanctions to be lifted, as well as two is decreasing sanctions allows for NGOs to get more involved in bringing in aid. A is in status quo orgs or like IRC don't want to enter, which means they can't bring in food and health aid. B is NGOs are key. They lead to legitimacy and create infrastructure for more assistance. Government can always kick them out if they're doing something bad. Well, internal link is one. Food insecurity insecurity is bad and leads to worse forms of structural violence. A is food insecurity. 49.2% of all Iranians face food insecurity in 2021, according to research from the NIH. The average price of food for a four-person family in Iran is 3 times higher than that of the average income of a four-person family in Iran. Even if families have access to food, it's not nutritious because sanctions have to severely limited the diversity of the enter the country. 45 million people in Iran are facing nutritional deficiencies. For children going up with these conditions that causes chronic diseases later in life. The little point of this is an important dependency ratio of Iran's food market was about 25% after sanctions due to limitations in international financial exchanges, and a significant increase in the price of all food group occurred in 2018, the year after the imposition of sanctions. C's point is this leads to poverty. Low government action ensures people in poverty as government has to decrease government spending, decrease government welfare to help pay for food. This is uniquely true for the Iranian welfare system, as the 2020 report by the Justice Department states that the social insurance schemes and like other human rights such as right to maternity benefits, and family allowances have gone down. Impacts is one structure famine outweighs, because we have particularly that it's like a 50% of 50% of our Iranians, as well as an outweigh on time frame, probably because it's happening right now, prefer empiric, so as well as like people who are starving can't engage in the alternative movement. Roll the ballot. Vote for the team with the best post-fiat policy action. The framework when policy education is most real and applicable. A is policy results in the structure of power that affect material living conditions. B is the most proximal and internal link to alternative policy. B is it's key to knowing the state to engage with the policies. The alternative, we must understand how to engage with the status quo. 2 is the state's inevitable empirics. The state has historically gobbled up non-state societies. B is the state's the main producer of knowledge, which means our epistemology and ontology are shaped by the state. C is that means absent state engagement. K is also always be crushed. 3 is a policy making fiat is good. Fiat puts our hands on levels of power, key to coalition building and alternative policy. Fiat is a prior question agency because it matches agency with the current system. This is a prior question alternative because no agency denial has been resolved. Fourth, are good, even if violence is bad. It's probably good for groups like the Pink Pencils to protect themselves. 5 is a PIX flow app because legislative procedure means you can amend, but it's still under the name of the affirmation. 6 is affirm, means to state as a fact loudly and publicly. Open for flex.
Cool. We have all texts, right? Starting 2 minutes.
What do I say on this interview? Okay. Order's going to be one off, and then case in the order of framework, or your roll of the ballot, sorry, and then the solvency sheet, and then if I have time, I'll touch on your answers, or your, whatever they're called. I don't know. I'm really nervous. Okay. Yeah, it's going to be one off, and then case in order of the framework, the solvency sheet, and then the advantages. That's what they're called. Cool. Thanks, Adesha. Okay. Also, if you need to clear me at any time or slow me, please do it verbally. I'm not going to.
You muted yourself, I think.
Okay, sorry. That was my beat. Okay. Everyone good? Everyone can hear me? Everything's fine? Sounds good. All right. 8 minutes starting.
Wait, Kyle, wait. Was he muted for the order, y'all?
I only got like half of it, and then he muted himself.
Okay,
Yeah.
my bad. Order's going to be one off, case in the order of the roll of the ballot, solvency sheet, and then case in order.
Cool.
Sorry, I didn't even realize I was muted. I thought I was just talking the whole time. Great. Cool. Okay, now, if everyone's ready. 8 minutes starting. Now, welcome to the Skeld. We are calling an emergency meeting to find the imposter. The first argument is the framework. One, identity is unstable. The era of postmodernism is marked by an inability to locate identity in stable categories. A, the project of modernity has failed. We can no longer theorize society in homogeneous identities, which can then be totalized into grand theory or meta-narrative. B, the self is unable to maintain a stable core identity because the identity is necessarily fluid and dependent on historical or cultural situatedness. C, identity co-option is inevitable. Rachel Dolezal proves the inability to move in and out of identity, the ability to move in and out of identity positions because of the inability to look at members of identity groups as legitimate. Identity is not static, is constantly shifting and undermining understanding of the self that is not grounded in any of one theoretical explanation. Two, all thought is rhizomatic. The tree is grounded on one principle of root, where all thought divides from the main one. Anything is a derivative of the same truth. That this indicates the pedagogical project is not a matter of determining which arguments are the most correct, but evaluating your individual endorsement of strategies or pedagogical representations. Three, identity is not redeemable absent interrogation of one. How one look at their identity absent this constant questioning how we risk total collapse of any idea by which to explain the world around us. The latest that we don't contend that identity doesn't exist, but rather identity is a side of contestation that is only informed by a series of dichotomous positions. That is, I know what I am because I know what I'm not. Four, unstable identity makes nihilism inevitable. The problem in the status quo is that we are all constantly part and not part of a certain identity groups based on context. If our identities are not affirmed by social structures, we attempt to divorce ourselves from them to survive. Five, debate is key. We are engaged in a cooperative project of epistemological exercise with the ultimate goal of uncovering the truth while engaging in a competitive framework of debate that requires us to have the goal of winning a ballot. This has several implications. The first one is that prep decisions are predicated on a number of factors. Argumentative utility and parent considerations indicate that we have an understanding of argumentative representations which form particular context-specific identity categories. B, determining whether you should prep for a critical AF is dependent entirely on whether your opponent has set the precedence of being topical on the AF and the likelihood that they will again. Conversely, the same conversation is had about condor teams to set counterplay teams, specifically flexible teams, regardless of if we make the correct decision in prep, our strategies are still guided by the kind of identity coding we engage in to preempt our opponents. And the third point is that judge philosophies prove our desire to locate judges situationally within the ontological conception of debate and for a decision making for strikes, press, and adaptation each round. We locate judges in certain identity positions like hack and policy hack. 6, to be clear, our argument is not that identity is bad or that these arguments ought not to exist. Our argument is that we have to protect the ability to have a conversation about identity, and we have to root out the imposters that engage in it arbitrarily and reduce its liberatory value. The first point, our identity in debate is defined through our endorsement of pedagogical strategies. It's true that the identities are also fluid, that people ought to be able to occupy multiple at once, but we control unique people disingenuously engage in identity for their own benefit. We have to test their genuine endorsement of their argument. The second point to this is that Leah Thomas indicates that dominant groups already do this kind of gatekeeping of the status quo. They root out Leah as a biological man to protect the position of woman. That means it's try or die for the alt to establish a reasonable process for this kind of interrogation that is based on understanding of identity that is necessarily fluid, that is like gender can change post-birth, which prevents this kind of violence. 7, the role of the judge is to act as an innocent crew member to help root out the imposter. Again, the role of the judge is to act as an innocent crew member to help root out the imposter. Reasons to prefer: 1, the role of the judge affirms debate as a collaborative activity to generate the most education. We are all crew members tasked with protecting the crew and completing our task. Anyone that poses a threat that ought to be revealed. B, this doesn't demand the judge prefers a certain argumentation position, rather it's meant to ensure that everyone is engaging pedagogy in good faith. See the double bind: either the AF is sus, you got to vote them out to protect the crew, or the AF is the imposter, we have to vote them out to narrow down the decision and find out the imposter next round. The links: 1. The AF assumes their identity of a policymaker, they can claim that they role play, but it's not a question of role playing. It's a question of deception. Their approach to role playing still allows them to access power from a position that ought not to belong to them. You're not policymakers. That's certainly not the Republic of Iran. You're college debaters, and that's rather sus. The first point here is that FDR assumes that their actions engaged within the AF of real and impact to the AF team's defense. That means that any claim of solvency is the equivalent of Rachel Dolezal pretending to be black while occupying the position of NAACP president. And the double bind here is either the AF fiat their solvency and you vote them down because they're sus, or the AF doesn't fiat their solvency and you vote negative on presumption. The second point is that the AF's description of the world relies on the assumption of knowable identity. That is like citizen, non-citizen, but their method always fails in a world of unstable identity. Rhizomatic thought means it's impossible to solve through one theoretical approach. That's like realism. Three, they were in the vents. Their ability to engage in policy making when all of their crew members can is sus. Only the imposter in the room is able to generate meaning from policy discussions. That is like only cis women are able to generate value in women's supports, whereas trans women can't readily access the same value. Little M says that the policy making is inaccessible to the molar identity. Binary subjects that can be located within a body with organs can occupy a stable subject from which they can constantly generate meaning. That's like the citizen can vote, whereas the non-citizen does not have the same level of access to those structures. Four, the JCPOA itself is sus. Iran was incredibly compliant with the deal up until the U.S. pullout in 2018. The pullout was arbitrary and independent verification of the Iran was in compliance at the time of the U.S. sanctions. Little is that the AF wants you to believe that somehow on Iran to reinvigorate the JCPOA, even though that they're currently still a part of the agreement. They can only begin breaches to determine operational limits after U.S. pullout. And B, that's sus as fuck. Their entire link story requires on the uniqueness that isn't true and misrepresents the reality of the situation. Was not productive pedagogical project of the day. Thus, the impacts one. Unstable identity makes interpersonal structural violence inevitable. The dichotomous hierarchies pit individuals against each other. Rectify difference. Crenshaw explained the best. The black women's push out of questions of legality because they cannot look at power from their woman under their blackness, whereas white women and black men have some inverse systemic value and thus can engage in violence against those that don't. It's where the white feminists ignore women of color and queer women, and so do black liberation movement. Two, postmodernism is a market struggle by which identified identity, which makes policy failure inevitable. It's why the U.S. exports citizens, not citizens alike, because of an ability to clearly determine who belongs in a particular identity category. So he doesn't just try it out for the goal to develop a strategy to determine who is protecting who it isn't. That's the alternative. Vote negative in the emergency meeting to eject the AF. Again, vote negative in the emergency meeting to eject the AF. The solvency one. The debates in the emergency meeting suss that the imposter, their pedagogical approach to debate can only be affirmed if we're able to determine who they are and what their role is, meaning that the AF solves the AF, but you can't evaluate the AF. Two, the only way to determine the imposter in the debate space is to vote negative. It's a simple question of statistics and evidence. The uniqueness says that there's definitely an imposter in debate, and the links prove that they're most likely to be the imposter. That means if you vote to eject them now, regardless of if they are the imposter, we have narrowed it down enough to find out who is. Three, if you don't know who the imposter is, you should still vote negative on presumption. You should be highly skeptical of their solvency claims and know someone is lying, and it can easily be them, so there's no way to determine the validity of their claims absent the all. Realize that we are not the imposter in the laboratory completing our tasks when the AF happened. We couldn't have possibly murdered our crew member, and B, the AF has incentive to call us the imposter because we reported the murder. We found the dead crew member and called the emergency meeting the imposter. Has no incentive to call the meeting because they want to get away with as many murders as possible before they are discovered. And C, this implicates 1% risk of a link to the AF because you vote for that means you vote for the all. The link defense is not enough because of course the imposter would defend themselves, but we would report a murder if we would commit another before we were caught. The four, the judge can also be the imposter. We are all crew members and have an equal chance to be the imposter. If any of you if any of you are, that you would vote for us and eject the AF to save face anything less is about strategy and corrupts the decision around. And five, there's no firms. We already called you sus. The judge can't vote for both of us or neither of us. The emergency meeting has already started, and the only way to end it is to vote for someone. On case, on solvency. One, the AF is nonsense. Iran has already joined the JCPOA. It is not formally withdrawn as a response to the U.S. pullout in 2018. Iran began engaging in nuclear development, which violated some of the operational limitations, but they're still subject to UN verification. The first breach of the JCPOA occurred in 2018 when the U.S. arbitrarily imposed sanctions on Iran despite their verified compliance with limitations of the JCPOA. Two, following the U.S. refusal to lift sanctions, Iran engaged in 5 separate breaches of the operational limits of the JCPOA, including limits on uranium enrichment and refusing to comply with research limitations. See, all of these breaches are known because Iran has continued to allow UN verification to determine that they're in breach of the JCPOA, which indicates that Iran is not left, they've just been non-compliant. This has several implications. One, the AF is nonsense. There's no evidence generated from joining something that you're already a part of and does not rectify Iran's non-compliance because that's not the status quo. Two, this means you can't evaluate any portion of the AF because there is 0% change in the status quo. It's not even perceptual because everyone perceives Iran to be a part of the JCPOA now and non-compliant now. And three, Iran themselves indicated that they're willing to allow verification to continue renegotiate terms with me that they don't plan on pulling out anytime soon. Second point, inherency is a stock issue. One, the AF is not inherent. See, the unique stump arguments. But the second is that inherency is a stock issue. Little a is the AF burden, and it's necessary for the negative to have engagement and debate. Otherwise, no unique impact, which means no unique reason the AF is a bad idea. Two, moving target to a link does decide to go away because the AF doesn't do anything. But if we read these arguments, then you get to say that doesn't matter because the status quo solves. And three, this means bad education, go to scholarship, and engagement, bacon side from the ground. Yes. On the framework, overview to the framework. All of your impacts are predicated on the idea that your impacts are produced with good education. We are controlling global uniqueness in education, proving why you don't. The first argument. The first impact here is debate class, specifically that absent good education, no one's going to participate in debate because they're going to have to deal with things like tricksy landmines to get around debate. Meaning that debate's going to collapse because novices don't want to do anymore. But second is engagement because we can't even begin to engage with your things because you read an uninherent AF in the first place, saying that we can't even engage with it, which means that there's proven to be this framework's been proven wrong in this round, but it's been proven wrong in previous rounds as well, where you can't even engage in the first place.
Text, please.
Indeed. I'll get the roll of the judge call with the gold. Ready to start?
What's the inherent TVA?
Inherency is not a question of topicality.
Yes. What's a topical inherent AF?
What is a topical inherent AF? As in, like,
Yes.
what would be
Yes.
also topical? While
Yes.
still being inherent?
What should we have run that would have been inherent under this topic?
There is no topical inherent AF.
Okay. Status of the alt.
Unconditional.
Okay. So how do I know if I'm gay?
How do you know if you're gay?
Yeah.
You decide for yourself.
Okay. But like, when I decide to go to a gay club, who decides if I'm gay?
Well, if you go to a gay club, how do other people decide if you're gay?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand like this whole like identity formation thing of off the K. Like,
Yeah, our argument is not that identities in general are bad, or that fluid identities are bad, but specifically how they are localized within debate and contextualized within in debate. Our argument is that we assume certain identities when we begin debate, and that in the status quo and pertaining to your AF is an inauthentic form of engagement.
okay. What's your identity in debate?
In this round, we're the crew members.
Okay. All right. The order is going to be the AF and then the K. Top down on both.
AF framework is on the bottom of the AF.
Yep. Okay. If there's any problems, just holler at me. Cool. Group all of their articulations at the top of the affirmative. These are functionally going to be defensive. The articulation of inherency is functionally going to be a defensive question because there's always going to be a 1% risk that we are inherent, which necessarily means you can flow through all of the offense on the affirmative. There's always a 1% risk of offense on the affirmative, which we're necessarily going to get to in a second. But then they say that Iran has already joined. No, we say this isn't true. Iran literally left after the United States left. You're necessarily signatory. You can unjoin. We say that we are necessarily fiating that they rejoin. Even if this means it is a perceptual rejoin, we say that we still get access to what a join is. That's literally the only topical version of the affirmative. Under their world, there is literally no inherent topical AF, which means it's possible for the AF. That means you're going to give us a lot of leverage. We shouldn't lose for the fact that a bad topic was necessarily selected. Means that you're otherwise neg would win 100% of rounds to be terminally unfair, independently leads to collapse of debate. Then they say this is going to lead to a breach of PLG and lift sanctions. One, this empirically isn't true. We saw a massive lifting of sanctions at the end of the Obama era when they signed on to the GCPOA in the first place. Even if there's no even verification, we say that people are desperate enough for oil right now. They're necessarily going to trade, and NGOs independently check back. Then they make inherency questions. That inherency is a voting issue. It's necessary for engagement. A few answers here. One, does that presumption necessarily flip? So even if we're not inherent because we're risking a conditional alternative, we are that the presumption is necessarily flipped. So presumption is an AF voting issue. The second articulation is going to be inherency isn't a voting issue because inherency is not necessarily something that we control, whereas we are constrained by things like topicality. The third articulation is going to be that inherency is never a terminal defense because there's always a risk that we are inherent, which means we get often thrown to the first advantage. You can necessarily extend our articulations about how there's going to be a massive economic collapse right now in the status quo. And necessarily the only way to resolve back for this is to open up Iran and the sanctions and allow for them to ship out oil. We say this isn't happening in the status quo literally because agreements from the EU and the US exist right now in the status quo. They've conceded that the United States is going to join if Iran does, which means we get a bunch of oil and we get to avoid the collapse. This results from structural violence. Independently go on to the next one, which independently talks about like how people of Iran are necessarily going to be starving right now, and we resolve for structural violence. Okay, look, they concede the AF. It's only defense. We win the AF. It's just the K. Move on to the roll of the ballot. They say they control the global uniqueness of good education, but no, that's absolutely not true because policymaking is necessarily the global uniqueness of what we consider to even be valid education in the first place because we necessarily control the question of what is applicable. They say bad debate necessarily leads to collapse. One, we say you are an instantiation of bad debate because you're necessarily always going to be a form of postmodernism that's impossible to engage with. Your ivory tower is going to collapse debate. The second articulation is policymaking is the most accessible form of debate. It's what most people do in high school, and also things like critical literature are always behind paywalls of JSTOR, whereas ours is not. You can all just read NBC News. The third articulation is going to be that you are inherently going to be a bad form of debate because you're a reject alternative, which means that you literally don't engage except to say no, which probably means you're a bad form of debate. The fourth articulation is going to be that this is how debate gets funded in the future. IAP will go on to be policymakers, and if that necessarily validates debate, the real reason why people care about debate is because it lives in a war, and usually it necessarily means we're a prior question to the collapse of debate, which means we're literally out sequencing all of it. Your second articulation is that you necessarily can't engage, but no, we say this absolutely isn't true. We say this is the only way you engage. Go down in the framework. You're going to say that we're most real world applicable, which necessarily means we're terminally out framing all of you because we control what is necessarily real world and how you can apply it. We are the only form of material action, i.e. you're always going to devolve into something that is non-material, which means you never effectuate change in the real world, which means you're terminally useless. You reading this sus shit doesn't change the world. We at least have a 0.1% chance of doing it. The second articulation is going to be the state is inevitable. This is going to be really important for offense on the K because it means that the state is necessarily going to crush whatever movement you are trying to do in and outside of this round because we are all already coded by epistemology and ontology of the state. You can also extend that policymaking is uniquely good. This is really key. We say we have to imagine ourselves as policymakers in order to have any kind of agency whatsoever, which means that nihilism they talk about is terminally non-unique. It's try or die to vote for agency. Move on to the K. Start at the top. The first articulation is going to be that this position of unstable identity is really going to be inevitable. Queer people, we say that queer people can never necessarily be forced into a single identity, which means that the locus of identity is always going to be unstable for queerness because it's necessarily going to be an oppositional identity. This means that your method is going to be terminally anti-queer. Queer people can never engage in it because we are always already changing. There is no stable locus of our identity, even if you say we are sus. We'll get to that in a second, but the second is going to be that identity is necessarily inevitable and identity is inevitably unstable. We say identity has always been unstable because the self-identification is necessarily is going to shift by our access to information or access to epistemes in the first place, which necessarily means that there's no non-unstable form of identity because identity is always shifting as we come into interaction with new terms. The third articulation, the next they say pedagogical is about representation strategies. One is say we necessarily outweigh you because of our representation strategy is always going to be better in a world where the state is inevitable, i.e. your talk of identity doesn't matter because the state's always going to force us into being policymakers. And they say, what's this collapse argument? Like contestation? They say nihilism is inevitable within the status quo. One, we say we are the only way of checking back for nihilism because we necessarily engage in the material practice. But secondly, they've conceded that agency exists because we can't view ourselves as alive within the current system. They essentially skip a step here, i.e. we have to imagine ourselves alive in the current system before we can change the entire system. Second is you lead to nihilism because you lead to essentially a form of inwards ivory tower internal thinking, which necessarily is going to be a relink to the entirety of the case. Then they say debate is key because it forms identities. One is that you necessarily don't change as you say that we still you are still forming an identity for yourself by running this K, i.e. that of the crewmates, which we have no methods of testing. Then they say we necessarily need to protect that identity is protected because it's defined through pedagogical, but the Elia Thomas thing is going to be a massive relink because we necessarily say the state is going to co-opt your entire methodology, which necessarily means that people are going to use this idea of identity needs to be fixed or identity needs to be real to securitize against trans people. This is literally what's happening right now in the status quo. It's going to be the greatest instance of violence right now. It's because they're necessarily engaging in the language that there is a real identity or a true identity, which is always going to lead to truth testing against trans people. That's particularly harmful. We say that they might say this is status quo. We necessarily say this form of identity testing is literally what they advocate for because they are testing our own identity, which necessarily forces us to double down and engage in ontological violence against ourselves within the context around that's independently psychic. It's going to be independently psychic violence, so they are necessarily going to be presuming and attacking our identity. Go to the role of the judge. One is necessarily going to be going to be a massive capitalist relink because they are positing your existence as a crewmate off of your ability to complete tasks, which essentially means that you are only useful insofar you are a capitalist tool. This is always going to lead to infinite amounts of psychic violence because people who are queer and black and brown are always going to be told they'll never be a good crewmate. This is why people like women and black and brown people get voted out more on Among Us games. It's because the system is structurally racist against them. It means that they are just reifying these systems instead of inherently questioning them. Don't say they can necessarily resolve back just by rejecting the affirmative. Go to the links. First is going to be a real link. You necessarily assume an identity that's necessarily false. There's no way to know that you are a crewmate. We are not playing Among Us right now, which necessarily means that you are going to be a false version of the crew link. But then second is going to be real link because you utilize fiat as well. You force the judge to imagine the ejection of the affirmative, which is necessarily always going to be the fiat. You can't eject the affirmative, but you pretend like you do, which is probably going to be the biggest real link in this round, which means there's no link differential between us saying that we're going to fiat this and you do, and you saying you can eject us and you do, which necessarily means that there's going to be no link differential, but also real links are way more heavily linked. You say we adopt the identity of policymakers. One, we necessarily don't. We say we just advocate for it, but second, I literally am a policymaker. I make Title IX policy for rights, which probably indicates that I'm some degree of policymaker. The second articulation, they say we use identities, but okay, just group all this. These are all foundationally going to be links of emission, foundational links of emission, fiat, and policymaking identities necessarily successful. Then they say the JCPOA is sus. This literally makes no sense. Makes no sense for identity. We are not identifying the JCPOA, but also additionally, you're going to put IVI on sus. Sus is literally a homophobic term which is used to identify people. This is why people say like, oh, what you're doing is sus, which is always going to be literally like a form of anti-gay, of anti-queerness, which is probably going to be bad for them to be reading things that are necessarily analogous to like Gen Z slurs of this. Go to their impacts. They haven't weighed personal structural violence literally enough in this round. Go to the alt. The alt first is going to be the perm. Do vote AF to eject the AF. The next is going to be perm vote AF to eject the neg. These are both of the and perm do both. All these perms and net benefits are going to be the AF as well as the agency derived from fiat. But then there's two articulations here. One is going to be relink because it's necessarily the form of negative identification that they have. They say that they are crewmates because they are not the imposter, which they tell you that negative identity formation is the problem at the top, which means they can never resolve. But second is going to be rejection as always lead to independent offense of nihilism, because literally you rejecting the AF is not going to solve for all instances of identity. Probably means that they literally can't resolve for necessarily any of this. The next DA is going to be that they're probably the imposter, because the imposter is necessarily always going to be accusing people. They called the emergency meeting. They called the emergency meeting by the button, not by finding the body, which necessarily indicates that they are trying to root us up. And the next articulation is going to be that narrowing it down doesn't necessarily solve it, just makes it easier for them to continue to kill. The second articulation is going to be that they say they're no perm. It literally doesn't make sense. Just vote them out. But at the end of the day, this is fucking jack shit. It's literally just an attack on identity that's going to be co-opted by the state and used to securitize against queer and trans people. They don't do fucking anything in the debate. They just say reject us. What the fuck is this shit? Vote AF.
Cool. Start in 2 minutes. Order is going to be the criticism with an overview on top of the criticism. And then it is going to be the... actually, yeah, it's just K in order and then F in order. Actually, on second thought, I'll put the AF framework on top of the AF. So overview, critique, AF framing, and then really it's just going to be the inherency press after that. Okie doke. Anyone not ready? Cool. You vote negative in this debate because they are conceding global uniqueness claims that indicates the co-option of identities is already terminally non-unique in the status quo. The implication of this argument is that the engagement that people will use to engage within debate is fundamentally inauthentic, which they have conceded kills the pedagogical value of the space. That turns all of their solvency and policymaking considerations, even if they are right that generally thinking about policymaking is good if it is done in an inauthentic manner, then it's impossible to actually gain any sort of solvency or long-term educational benefit, which means we're always going to be a prior question to the affirmative. Starting on, and second overview. They have also conceded out of cross-sex in the original PMC that we are not an indict of all identity writ large, rather we are a specific indict of identity as we adopt them within debate, specifically that people adopt things like the notion of the condo cop of the revolutionary when they do not actually mean those things, which forces inauthentic engagement and ensures that we never actually create good norms or good pedagogical standards, because people only do tricksy things in order to win. Our alternative is a total turning away from that system, which means that we absolutely are able to solve why any of your educational considerations matter in the first place. Let's start on top of the framework. I want you to extend the argument that identity is fundamentally unstable in the status quo, that the project of modernity has failed. There is no stable identity. Rather, there's one that's constantly shifting, which forces a form of abstraction as people since people define themselves based off who they are, not as much as who they are. That necessarily is critical because it means that it's impossible to understand who is authentically engaged. And they've also considered that all language in space is fundamentally rhizomatic, and that all debate is only a pedagogical and collaborative project, which means there's only a question of how we can best engage. They've also considered top-level proximity framing, which means that it's not a question of just what we might be able to do at some point in the future with knowledge, but rather how we can best engage within this space to create knowledge in the first place. Not only does that mean that we're a sequencing question to the methodology of the affirmative, but it also means that we necessarily are always going to outweigh any of their impacts because they're not proximal to the debate community in general. Now let's go into their arguments on the framework. First, they say that we're anti-queer because we know necessarily force people to either out themselves or anti-fluid identity. No, we literally have an argument that we do not necessarily say identity or even fluid identity is a bad thing. We are not an indictment of identity as it exists in general. Rather, we are only an indictment of how people use inauthentic identity in the debate space, which there's no link to your argument here. Secondly, you have conceded that all types of co-option of identity is terminally non-unique in the status quo, specifically that people already adopt things like queer theory when they don't actually care or mean any of it, which indicates there's no actual impact of to this argument. Third, you have also conceded that we do not necessarily force people to out themselves because we are not saying that you need to say whether or not you are queer. Rather, you just have to prove that you are an authentic engagement, which means that you don't actually need to explain your own identity. There's no impact to any of those arguments. Now on to some of your nihilism answers. Your only argument here is that there's only that only you can check nihilism by imagining about the future and by adopting things like new identity is absolutely not true. You have conceded the argument that currently due to the pedagogical indicts of the space, we cannot actually engage in verifiable policymaking. So even if you are imagining about a better future, that future is never actually promised to you in the first place, which indicates reasons why pedagogy is always going to be a prior question. Now let's go on to extend the fifth frame argument that debate is necessarily key. They have conceded all of the warrants on this. They indicate the way they already inframe people within debate, i.e. identifying people and judges as K-hacks, policy hacks, K-teams, or mixed teams in general is already a way that we demarcate identities within the space in the first place. They've also conceded that is going to lead to the collapse of the debate, which is always going to be a prior question to the solvency mechanism of the 1AC. Now, their only other argument on this is that we necessarily force this is like the Leah Thomas argument. They say that that the state co-opts our methodology, which turns all of our ethical considerations absolutely not true. First argument is that we are not necessarily a purity test of what we don't work about, that we don't force people to out themselves. Rather, we just force them to ensure that they're actually authentically engaging in this space. No, there's no way that the state co-ops our identity because our like literally all our alternative is one based off of an Among Us game, but two is also necessarily premised on people like engaging authentically. The state doesn't like to engage authentically, which means there's no reason the state would actually want to qualify and move it. Third, you're also conceding terminal uniqueness claims that indicate that this is already happening in the status quo, which means there's no unique impact of that argument. Go onto the role of the judge, extend the role of the judge to act as an innocent crew member to suss out the imposter. Their only argument here is that we say the word tasks and that somehow that's capitalism law. Great argument, but I do not think it indicts any of our reasons as to why necessarily sussing out the imposter is a good thing. If any of our impacts about why valuing debate as a pedagogical space is true, then it acts as a prior question to any of your cap considerations. You also don't have a verifiable impact, aside from saying that somehow like discrimination gets worse on this one. One, you're conceding uniqueness that indicates it's already happening right now. But secondly, this is not a capitalist because we're talking about tasks. All we're saying is that you ought to try to make this space pedagogically valuable, which is not necessarily talking about things like real money value, rather just pedagogical value, which is the antithesis of capitalism in the first place and is always going to come first. Now, links. The only link I want to extend is the first link that you're necessarily role-playing as Iran, which is a form of inauthentic engagement in the space. You conceded the ASA point, which is that fiat assumes that there is some sort of long-term solvency mechanism for your affirmative, but you have conceded that there's literally not all of their arguments about policymaking being good or being allowed us to engage in the space are just a inauthentic way of engaging. Ask yourself, what policy do they identify has ever been solved via a fiat debate plan text? None. They cannot give you a warrant, which indicates the reasons why we have game on our question that they are just inauthentically reading framework in order to win debate battles, but that does not produce a good form of pedagogy, especially in the context of all of our inherency press that indicates that this literally has already passed, which means they do not have game on having authentic engagement in the space. Their argument here is that they do make policy because they make Title IX stuff for rights. How is that Iran? I do not know. You should absolutely pass an app about changing Title IX in the debate circuit or changing Title IX in rights. That is not Iran, which indicates that there's a massive link differential here. Now for your relinks, they make the argument that we relink into the position because we are imposters. There's a bunch of reasons as to why this is not true. First and foremost, we have verifiable links that have extremely clear warrants as to what you are doing that makes you an inauthentic form of engagement in the space. They have not read a single reason as to why we are a similar type of inauthentic engagement, which means that you should weigh the quality and quantity of our evidence against us when you're deciding who you vote out, which is always going to flow negative. Secondly, you have also conceded the mathematical arguments that indicates that even if you're right that we are the imposters, you should still vote them out this round, us in finals, which indicates that we still have solvency mechanisms for our alternative. Lastly, you make the argument here that there's an IVI because we said the word sus. This is absolutely not an offensive implication for you. One, the first argument is reclamation. The term sus is used in homophobic context primarily by cis heterosexual men online. We are not using sus in that context. We're actually using it contextually and appropriately. The ASA is allowing fascists and homophobes to claim ownership over all the language, seizes the political, and gives power to those who deserve absolutely none of it. You should allow us to use terms like this in a context where we're trying to reclaim identity, which is the antithesis of the term in the first place. Now, for the impacts, extend all of the impacts by how the infinite structural violence is always going to happen in a war of not being able to identify who is authentically engaging in spaces, which turns all of their considerations on case and also necessarily go to outweigh on proximity. They've also conceded the policy failure argument that when we inauthentically engage in a space like this, it is always makes policy doomed to fail, which also turns all of their policy making considerations. It means you have to consider consider the alternative as a necessary prior question, even if they're right that generally thinking about the future is good. Their version of doing it is not something that we should engage with. Subpoint B is they've also conceded global union on this question, which is that even if you are somehow an authentic engagement in space, the rest of the debate community writ large is not, which means that engaging in the project is always going to be a prior question. Now on for the alternative, they have not actually addressed the alternative solvency mechanism. Extend all of our arguments that necessarily ejecting the imposter is absolutely critical in order to resolve for all of the arguments of pedagogy within this space, and the voting negative is key for doing that. They've also conceded the mathematical arguments that indicate that even if they are not the imposter, voting them out is still a good thing because it allows us to narrow down the field later on for both of their permutations. You can group them because they're incomprehensible. You cannot both eject the affirmative and also vote for them. It is not something that they can actually do, and we have articulated the solvency mechanism of what ejecting them means as voting them down, which means that there's no game on either of their permutations. They are fundamentally incompatible, but also the links serve as independent disadvantages because if they are an inauthentic form of engagement and they are the imposter, that only makes it worse. That is their own articulation. Next, they make these arguments that we are relinks. I've already answered that. They say rejection is nihilism. No, I've already answered nihilism in general, but also you've conceded that nihilism is non-unique in the status quo, which is not an impact that argument. Thirdly, the rejection does not necessarily cause nihilism. We can always start a new game next year and have more fun again. The third argument they say is that the imposters call the meeting all the time, and that narrowing down doesn't actually solve. We say it absolutely does. One, because we can get ejected next round if we are the imposter, which means you're still capable of solving, but also imposters usually will not call meetings and bring tons of evidence against other people and have sick-ass arguments as to why they're sus. Case. Don't like that argument. Even if you don't like the K, it doesn't matter because we are winning terminal inherency press. They have conceded the argument that indicates that like their app has literally only passed. They've only had an appeal that says, but you should give us some game of solvency. 3 reasons you should have won. Iran literally already joined. There was absolutely no inherency, which means that you should only give them offense based off of perceptual joining, which is not something that they have articulated. All of their links are predicated on Iran actually joining, which they have conceded they don't actually do. They just perceptually join, which means there's no actual hero. Also, this serves as a massive ruling because it's a shift from the 1AC, which proves they are a form of inauthentic engagement. K comes before policy making.
Okay, I'm going to try not to mute myself this time. The order is going to be, or actually, there's not really an order. I fill my LOR in a new sheet, but kind of general, it's going to be the criticism and then case. Kind of same stuff Matt talked about, just in a little bit different order. All signpost. Sweet. 4 minutes, starting. Now, you are going to be voting to eject the affirmative off the scale. For the first reason is the framework question. We are winning fire articulation coming out of Matt's MO about why they're conceding that the co-optation is fundamentally non-unique, which turns almost all of their arguments on the criticism entirely. They've conceded that inauthentic engagement kills pedagogy, and that bad faith arguments are fundamentally bad for debate because it's going to collapse and inflate the debate space. Cross-apply the articulation about why we are not an indictment of identity writ large, but rather an indictment of identity within the debate space because people are able to engage in like tricksy things that they don't actually believe in, which leads to bad pedagogy, bad faith articulations. Matt does a fire job of extending the framework points about why identity is fundamentally unstable in the debate space because of who we are and who we are not, and it's impossible to determine exactly who we are, which means that specifically that pedagogy in debate is fundamentally key in order to be able to gain any sort of portable knowledge from this space. But secondly, proximity, that the knowledge creation is fundamentally a sequence of question in this debate round. Yes. Okay. So the third point here is that nihilism. That you've conceded that pedagogy. That you can see that the argument here that pedagogy is fundamentally, or that this is terminally non-unique, but specifically that their kind of non-verifiable policy making is exactly the kind of behavior that we're critiquing. But fundamentally here that we are saying that debate itself is key. That framing people. That framing people in debate is fundamentally in their demarcating their identity is fundamentally key. That the absent this will collapse debate and cause co-option, but that's fundamentally not true because we're literally not purity testing. We're just trying to ensure authentic debate space, meaning that no co-option. We're literally an Among Us AF. Or neg, sorry, we're literally an Among Us neg. But further than that, it's more important because the state is not necessarily you're not able to engage with the state authentically. On to the impacts. Extend across the role of the judge about why we must suss out the imposter. That the capitalism literally doesn't indict any of us. Don't give them any credence on any of this because we're literally a pedagogical indictment of debate. Just because we said the word caste does not mean that we're capitalist. Don't give them any. They haven't had any unique impacts. They conceded that this is fundamentally non-unique, meaning that making the space pedagogical is also in the antithesis to don't give them any game there. But so that infinite structural violence and authentic debate dooms policy making to fail because they've conceded global uniqueness that we control. That the project is a prior question to any of their articulation on the opinion that we're winning on the impact. We are fundamentally outweighing on any of the effects of infinite structural violence and policy failure, meaning that you don't even get to do the things like you're out in the first place, meaning that we don't even get to become good policymakers in the future. On the links, 1. You are quite literally role playing as Iran. You try to assume long term solvency, but that's fundamentally inauthentic. Because literally, what policy? Name yourself one single policy that's been solved by a fiat and plan text in debate. Not a single one. We don't do shit outside of the debate round. And your articulation that you've also read non-inherent arguments, meaning that there's no authentic engagement here either. But see your Title IX point that Title IX is not Iran. You're not Iran. Don't give them credence on this argument. But specifically to answer the relinks that we have given you specific verifiable links with clear warrants about why they are engaging in inauthentic debate, but specifically they can see the math arguments that any of their solvency fundamentally that takes out any of their solvency. There's you might as well just vote them out anyways. So they address the IVI. Any other articulation on the IVI is just fundamentally a non-starter because we are literally reclaiming the word sus away from the fascist white supremacists that are trying to take away, that are trying to create homophobic environments online. We're using it quite literally in context. So you don't give them any game on here because absent that it sees the political, which is uniquely bad for the debate space in and of itself. To weigh out the impacts here, again, infinite structural violence and inauthentic policy dooms policy to fail. This is the most proximal and probable impact in this round because they're quite literally engaging in exactly the kind of harms that we are articulating, meaning that this is the most proximal and you will be voting on the impacts here if nowhere else, but specifically on the alternative. On their permit self-use, the permits incomprehensible because you're going to be voting them. You're going to be voting them down because you can't literally vote both of us out at the same time. But all of the links that we have rendered have been disadvantaged as to why the permit is just fundamentally a bad idea. That nihilism is fundamentally non-unique, and that the rejection does not lead to nihilism, meaning that the narrowing of the field is just fundamentally solved, meaning that you should reject them on that. But even if you're not buying any of this, then don't give them any credence on the case because of the inherency issues.
Okay, the order is going to be overview, AF, K. Everything will mostly be top down, but also signpost if I get need some form of cross application. Is there anyone not ready? Cool. Vote F because we're winning the offense differential because we are winning the affirmative with no offense on it, but there is a risk of offense onto their methodology as well as the alternative. The point at which this happens, you look to the affirmative. Cross-apply their articulation. They say that we only get perceptual offense, and they say we have now, but this is literally not true. They just later can see that we give our second solvency point B, saying that even if no one actually joins or does anything with the JCPOA, it's a perception of them actually doing that of Iran actually being in accordance and as well as the US being rejoining, which be again a particular solvency links to all of our advantages would be able to solve back for economic recession, which is the biggest impact of today's round because it solves back for a billion people into poverty as well as social violence through famine in Iran, which means we do have solvency, as well as go onto the framework. It's particularly damning when they say when they can see that state's inevitable, which means it controls our epistemology, which means the social pedagogy of identity fluidity is inevitable within the context of the state, which means we're going to be independently be prior to the negative because of the point at which the state has the ability to crush and co-opt their identity testing methods, which means it's always going to be under the instantiation of a state ideology, which means you have to understand the state before you can actually create identity testing that's unable to be co-opted by the state, which means you look to the affirmative first, as well as we say. FDI is going to be uniquely key to agency, which means it's going to be a car question any alternative, i.e. pedagogical method, which means you have to vote affirmative to actually reject the affirmative, which means the perm it completely has some functionality, which means you give a scan on the permutation as well. Go on to the okay. The global uniqueness doesn't matter when the K makes no fucking sense. First of all, they link harder. There are going to be two relinks. The first is going to be they are inauthentic. They are literally reading this K only as a way to win this debate round. They cannot eject us, but they pretend that they can. We are not in game of Among Us, but they pretend we are. All their arguments can be applied to them, or as our identity is proven to be authentic, as well as we just cross apply what they say with like why mathematics functions in their favor rather than our favor. Even though voting either of us down would narrow down the odds, they say just vote for them because they want to go to finals. This one is damning because it's 100. The next one is damning. Was it fiat, right? Yeah, the fiat relink is going to be uniquely damning because it's 100% draw, which means you get 100% risk of this office. Tell you that a fiat is always going to be a form of link because they also feel they require you as a judge or a crew member to require the imagination to imagine the alternative taking place, which is literally fiat is a relink to 100% of the criticism and articulation that relinks way harder. Relinks way harder than links because you knew what you were running and you still linked into the ideology that you are criticizing. Threes, if they link harder, but for the perm to reject them because they are more likely to be imposters in the first place, which means the mathematics flip in our favor. Even then, extend that they don't solve anything. There's no reason why rejecting this one affirmative means that you're able to resolve for all of the structural violence of debate, which means like it's gonna be huge impact mitigation because like you haven't articulated why this specific round has led to any structural violence, which means that there's no spillover. There's literally no spillover. They stretch out the identities and everyone shifting, which means that it is foundationally impossible to tell what is and what isn't authentic.
This might be a flowing mistake, but I don't think that I have any defensive arguments about the alternative's ability to solve for debate in general or broader structural violence in the community.
I have it out of the MG, and it's just impact weighing or implications of alt answers.
It's a panel. I'm sure it's under consideration.
Sure. Yeah. Either way, I'm done here. Just go on next one. Where was I? Okay. I'm at 310. It shows identity isn't everyone shifting, which means it isn't foundationally impossible to tell what is and what isn't authentic because our identity shifts when we learn new words or meet new people. This means there's no such thing as authenticity and no case solvency. They also generate new nihilism by just rejecting. Even if nihilism is happening right now, you solve jack shit by just rejecting more. That means it is a triad to actually do something, which means you affirm to stop nihilism, like imagining ourselves like actually do something in a world that has like even if there's material nihilism, we say that the agency rejects like ideological nihilism, as well as even that's enough. Their K is an independently bad method. There's also often said that authenticity testing is bad. They misarticulate. They say that like they misarticulate our our argument that identity is bad, but no, we're saying your authenticity testing is uniquely bad. And at least if honest, this is the Leah Thomas warrant. You say you don't want to test identity, but just authentic engagement identity. This is the same thing because even if you don't test whether something is trans, someone is trans, you test whether they are authentically trans or engage within a trans, which is the exact same thing functionally. You just say this happens in the status quo, but we say you articulate particularly a new instance of this that generates violence because the methodology forces queer people in debate to prove that they're authentically queer or black people that they're authentically black. This the state absolutely co-ops this because they take your methodology, use it to tell people that they're not authentic or have authentic endorsement of methodologies. Even if they don't, you lead to this in debate through the
uniqueness doesn't matter here because you still lead to a specific instance of violence, which is 100% provable.
Yeah, global uniqueness is okay. The basis of this PMR is that they are relinking into their criticism and exacerbating their impacts. The point in which you are bringing this into the debate space to further the like fluidity or fluidity of identity as the negative, which means there is risk of offense on the negative. There's no risk of offense onto the affirmative. Vote F.
Good round, y'all.
Yeah, good round, y'all. It's always fun.